Do we know?
Great, this is the September meeting of the Parks and Rec Advisory Board for Lake Forest Park. Let's start with review of the prior. Actually, I don't have this week's agenda. I'm going to grab a little bit there. Let's put together.
Yeah, I didn't forgot to save.
That's right. No, we got all of it. Just the one.
Save and save.
Let's take a look at the agenda that we have. We're going to review the minutes, look at some like park project and a few other updates. Anything else to add to that from anyone? Or does that agenda seem about right? And if so, feel free to move to approve it. Great, all in favor?
Aye.
Does that sound okay, Amy?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, that's all of us. Then look at the July meeting. We haven't met since July. Take a look at those. If you have any notes, let us know. Or if it looks okay, we could move in that direction. Thank you. Second, all right. If the prior meeting minutes for July look okay, please indicate your assent. Great, that's everybody. Thank you. Now we can get to business. So thank you for all that. I guess we have a special guest again. Or is that where we're starting?
Yeah.
Okay, great. To give us a little update.
Okay, great. Let me.
Speed bump there.
I do, but I'm not an everyday Zoom user, and so I'm having trouble finding the commands here. Okay. Share. All right.
There you go.
Okay, good. Okay.
Yep. Nice.
All right. So thanks everyone for having me here today. So we are officially in phase 2 of the project, which means that we've completed our master planning work in phase 1. And our phase 1 was a 12-month process of basically July 2023 to July 2024. So August 2024 has kicked us off into phase 2. This is a 18-month process, phase 2, and run us through what that looks like. So we kicked off in July with council approval in July 2024. We've got essentially our 2 overlapping projects here. Our early works demolition, which is we just got notice to proceed today, which is really exciting news. So this was a long time coming, and it represents work that would have happened anyway, you know, for the project. So we knew that with the city's funding for acquisition of this project, they were not allowed to purchase the structures, and so the structures had to be torn down. We also know that from our structural assessments and from our hazardous materials assessments, it's a good idea that those come down. Funny things start to happen to buildings when nobody's in them or caring for them every day. So our early works demolition, we've got notice to proceed. This has been a project that we started in March, and it's going to carry on through basically December. The expiration date for the RCO grant that the city received to do the demolition work expires on November 30th. And so the work will be basically conducted and invoiced before then, and then the city gets to turn over all of those invoices to RCO to get reimbursed in the month of December for anything that happened up to but not beyond November 30th. So the big concern,
Spend all that money.
that's the goal. Yes.
So the goal first year you did this time around, or that was a previous?
That was a previous one. Yes. So it's $270,000, I believe was the grant amount. We're anticipating trying to spend, you know, as much of that through the demolition work There will be the structure demolition and some of the site cleanup, and then if there's any grant money left over, then the city will work with potentially someone to do some of the vegetation clearing, which we've learned from RCO would be an eligible expense and could be done with that. So that might be tree trimming to prepare for eventual construction. It might be relocating some of the vegetation that's on site. We're not 100% sure on that, but the intent will be as we draw closer to that, we know the schedule of when the first contractors will get out, how much money we're going to come to and what will be left over, then we'll schedule that work to also happen before November 30th. The big thing is, you know, the vulnerability of that funding to loss if we don't keep track of that expiration date. Okay, so this says kickoff anticipated soon. That essentially will be imminent now that we've got notice to proceed as of midday. Okay, so our phase 2 scope, as I mentioned, is 18 months. So that's design development phase, which is basically taking everything that was an idea and an illustration and putting that into design plan drawings. That will be submitting for our state and federal permits. Then we'll be moving into a construction documents phase. So that's taking those drawings that were submitted initially, what we're calling a 50% complete deliverable, advancing those plans to 70% and then to 100%, and then submitting for the rest of our permits. So as you know, there's a complicated permitting process for this project. We've got local, state, and federal permitting that has to occur in order to do some of the very critical elements of this. For example, federal permitting is the longest, it's the most onerous, it's the most tedious. You require a federal permit in order to be able to remove the dock on the Turner property that is derelict and not structurally sound. We cannot open the park until that dock is gone. So basically, even if just opening the park in its current condition was the plan, we couldn't do it until we applied for these federal permits. Those will take about a year, potentially longer, in order to do that one action to then open up the park in any capacity. So that's why we are submitting that 50%, and that's why we kind of rushed to prepare this 50% as the critical thing right out at the gate to make sure that we still have the ability to track for a park opening in 2027, which is the goal. Okay, so in November 2024 to December 2025, this will be all about refining those documents. So basically all of next year, refining those documents, going to additional cost estimation, getting refined pricing, seeing if there's some ability to cost manage, making sure that we get our permits in place, getting our permit comments, refining based on permit comments if we need to. And then the goal will be to complete those documents and be ready for a public bid process by the end of the year. The bid environment, we tend to see a more favorable bid environment at the end of the year and at the very beginning of the year. The middle of the year, when it's beautiful outside and everybody wants to be doing construction, tends to be the worst time to bid a project. And so the goal is to get a bid out in a favorable bid condition, hopefully, which it would be like December, January, likely January. And that's often when, you know, contractors are trying to fill the schedule for work and they're not like, well, we could take this project if it is enough. You know what I mean? If we get paid enough. So anyway, so that's just based on our experience. We can't guarantee that we'll get a low, you know, bid price, but that would be the goal, that we get a great contractor with a very fair, reasonable price for this work, and keep the project on target. So then our scope for the phase 2 contract basically ends at that bid process. So we'll open the bid, we'll respond to bid comments, and that'll spend out the last bit of that money. And the phase 3 contract, phase 3 of the project, would be related to construction. And so the construction of this project will require some oversight from the design team. That's very typical, and that we would expect to be the year 2026 and 2027. We're hoping that the project will be finished basically mid to quarter 2 to quarter 3 of 2027, and that the park will open at that time. Okay. So our progress report on early works. We've been through pre-design, plans preparation, and procurement on this project. So we'll move into construction. So just an update on that. Pardon me. We received bids from 2 qualified bidders, and this was through the small works roster process. So these are consultants that are licensed to work in Lake Forest Park. They get on a list and they are able to do projects under a certain dollar threshold. And so that is where we solicited bids from. The bid was approved by council on 9/12, and then we just got NTP today. We're expecting construction to start. I put again, September, October, because I didn't know when I wrote this presentation yesterday that we would get notice to proceed today. So, and then the construction completion is going to be prior to end of November, which is going to coincide with the RCO deadline. Okay, so our progress report on design development. So this is the work basically from, July to today. Design development is basically going to go through the month of November. So we completed some supplemental site investigations. So these are in addition to the site investigations that were done in phase 1. So when we did investigations in phase 1, it was, we'd like to build a park here. Let's see what the site entails. Now it's, we want to build a park that looks like this. And so some additional more, intensive site investigations were needed. So there was a supplement to the cultural resources study that was required. And that was basically initially in phase 1, when the city approached consultants about this project, it was for a project on the 2 new parcels. Going through all of the, planning with this committee, with the council, with the community, it became apparent that the project is actually 3 parcels. And so now that we're in phase 2, we need to go back and do the cultural resources study for that 3rd parcel, which is the Lion Creek Reserve parcel. So that's been completed. We also had a traffic analyses and parking study done. So this is a analysis of traffic movements through the intersection, and I can actually share that report with this group if we want to take a look at that. And then the parking study, we looked at basically similar sites to see what the parking demand is for a site like this. The hearing examiner's conditions on the existing park, that sort of was a decision was made about what parking is adequate for that, for the uses there. We're not changing the uses. If anything, we're actually diminishing the amount of trails that are on the site altogether, but we're just accepting that recommendation. So we're really doing a demand study for the 2 new parcels and looking at that. So the traffic consultant looked at precedent for parking determinations both in the city of Lake Forest Park and then at similar park districts around. So Bellevue, Kenmore, some others, looked at the parking demand ratio. So this is if I have a 2-acre park, then how many parking spaces are provided, and looked at those for comparative studies. So all of that summarized in the report, and there's a recommendation to, park this park basically, which is I think 22 spaces was the final recommendation. So the current design includes 10. And then the remainder of those would be provided as offsite parking at the City Hall parking lot. We know that there's already 3 parking spaces that are dedicated at City Hall. And so there would need to be a shared parking agreement for the remainder of those spaces. And then in addition to that, there will be basically a variance from the default parking requirement that Lake Forest Park has that we'll need to apply for as well. So a handful of things that came out of that study, but by and large, the study supports the way that we're going with the design. And it's just continuing to be part of this, permitting and documentation process to get the park moving ahead. Okay, so the geotechnical investigations, as I discussed with this committee last year, we know that this area of the lake, this area of the shoreline of the lake used to be the lake bottom. And so there is some concern about liquefaction risk or non-stable soils underlying the park. Based on the current seismic code, but not the code of when these buildings would have been constructed, buildings created on soft soils need structural reinforcement. And so we knew early on that there was the chance that this may be the case, and that would potentially increase the construction dollar number. If it meant reinforcing the structures, it would also increase the design dollar number. So we knew that was a possibility, but we didn't know that it was a certainty back then. And so we did include our construction cost numbers and our design cost numbers to cover that in case that was the case. What we did learn from the geotechnical investigations, the report is not completed, but I did sit down with geotech and get a preliminary information back on that, is that yes, we are seeing, liquefaction, soft soils, as we would anticipate in a former lake bed. And so it was not news that we didn't expect, but it was not great news that meant that we're going to shave, nearly $750,000 off the construction cost of this park. So the number did not get smaller based on the geotechnical recommendations, but it was something that we kind of knew was a possibility anyway. Okay, and that report we should be receiving in early October. And that's sort of that last piece that we'll need in order to complete some of our federal and state permitting applications. Okay, so the 50% plans preparation. So as a, oh sure,
The traffic
yes.
study.
Mhm.
does that take into consideration, like? It's such a unique property that
Mhm.
like has like difficult in and out. And
Mhm.
competing, like when it's going to be popular is also gonna be when the Civic Club's popular.
Mhm.
Are there considerations just around like how the traffic will work through there?
Mhm.
Just, I get the parking spot piece, but, just. It's such a, yeah, a unique traffic study that you can like anticipate.
Right. So we have worked with this traffic consultant before, and they are good at sites that don't fit the ITE manual. So the Institute for Transportation Engineers has a manual that says if you have a grocery store, it's going to require X. And it's going to load this many trips on, and its peak hour for shopping is going to be this. And so this is what's going to happen to the roadway sort of surrounding. So this, like as you mentioned, doesn't really fit that, right? And so you need to kind of draw on multiple sources and make a good case to defend what the supporting recommendation is. And this traffic consultant is very good at that. And so the report does lay out some of, what parallels examples within the IT standards and then what doesn't. And so I do think that in terms of what's been recommended, we know that the recommendations are not going to go so far back to the intersection because that's outside of the scope of this study. But we do know that this traffic consultant early on in the project in phase 1 provided a set of recommendations to the city, basically after a review of the 90% sound transit plans, looking at the intersection diagram and saying, we think that these changes would be beneficial to the park and to everything around the park, but it's not part of the park scope necessarily. So now their viewpoint is enriched by the fact that they have contributed, they have this contributing data for the traffic analyses and all of that and the traffic counts. And so I can ask them to go back and take a look at those early on recommendations that they made for some of the greater improvements and see if there's anything else that they would add or if they want to stand by their initial recommendation. So that's definitely something that we can ask them to do. But yeah, in terms of like what are we looking at a full reconfiguration of, Ballinger Way where it crosses 522 and Beach Drive and everything? No, that's not. And it's also one of those things that, sometimes there are uses that predate another use, but is it really the subsequent use that caused the overloading on the highway or roadway, or is it, a combination of multiple things? And so it is an interesting question. It is an interesting discussion for sure, and probably is something for the city to think about in terms of how they'll evaluate what is the obligation of this project to do, and then what is other changes that needs to look at for, the roadway configuration around the park. And if we do want to have a discussion with the traffic consultant more focused on that specifically, we can definitely do that. Yeah.
Sure. I thought it was interesting, like Tyler brought up a good point early on with the parking piece
Mhm.
where there are 10 spots, but then there are lots of people who believe that there could be a spot that drive through there.
Right.
And I'm just curious if that's something that we can also consider people that.
Yeah, and so part of, that behavioral, behavioral coaching, basically, do I think there's one there? And so am I gonna keep circling? Some of that we know can be managed through things like just not saying that there's ever long-term parking there. And so operationally saying that it's all short-term parking, that even if someone's in that space, it's a 15-minute load and unload, so there will be a space 15 minutes from now. So is this the sort of thing where people queue up, or is this the sort of thing where you can manage it, where people are effectively using the drop-off motion that we've created? So, and we'll look at some of that, in the plan, but with the staging area there, with being able to drop things off, with having the kayak racks, and trying to instill in people that the behavior that we want them to have is one of drop off and then park off site. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So it is definitely going to be something that as we are talking to the community about how they intend to use the park, and as the city starts to see the community using the park moving ahead, there may have to be some additional controls, right? And I know that this is something that's already done on Beach Drive when there are events and things like this to make sure that people can, get by to get to their homes on Beach Drive. And Tom had mentioned some times where they, I guess, block it off and do a little bit of traffic management. Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why we're looking at permitted, like for the house or office building, and then really it's just gonna be floated on, so people will just know there's no parking.
Yeah, it's rough to get in and out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that street currently have a residential parking zoning, or is it open to park down front? Beach Drive.
So it's not currently permitted. Yeah, it's not a zone, and there is some, it is a public street of private uses. It's not like a privately owned street, you know? But there's not like another trail opener or anything further down Beach Drive. And so in that case, you know, the residents of Beach Drive do depend on parking on their street for things like guests and overflow, which everybody depends on that on their own street. And so there's definitely, you know, we know right now that when there's parking overflow at places like the Civic Club, there is increased demand for that
Yeah.
spaces. And so we can, you know, we can assume that some of that may happen as part of this project. And I think what the project team is trying to ensure are what are the things both related to the design and then both related to the suggested operation that we can manage that effectively. And so I think within the design, what we can say is, you know, we could commit as much parking on this site as the Civic Club has. And it would leave no room left, and it would be astronomically expensive because it would be parking in the shoreline zone. And it would be very, very tough in terms of getting that project permitted. Or we can work with the city and the community to explore other options. And in that way, it is a design limitation. So we're favoring this sort of, you know, one-way turn loop to kind of get people through and out as quickly as possible. There's not, you know, an array of rows that you can kind of wait and sit around and move around in. We are looking at slightly more than recommended, you know, so in terms of ADA spaces, load and unload, making sure that we have a clear path for emergency vehicles. So even if people are queued up in the drive aisle, can an emergency vehicle still get down to the beach if they need to? And so we're looking at, you know, all of those conditions and planning for that specifically. So traffic is a concern for sure. But I do think that in all of the things that this park has related to traffic that many parks don't have, it will be access to regional trails, access to transit, access to nearby parking where there's already an established behavior of parking at City Hall and walking over. You know, this is a movement and a behavior that people are very, very well aware of in terms of getting to Beach Drive. And so many places you would have to coach people to get used to that as an acceptable park and walk distance. And in this case, we have that behavior already. So I think if there was a candidate for a walk and bike based park, I think this is a very good one.
And then the flex stand too was really exciting. Like, we're right, Ballinger's right on it.
Oh, great.
On the what?
The flex van, it's like basically Metro's Uber, and they just incorporated North Shore, so it's not, it's like runs that, the border of it runs along Ballinger, but it comes down to the lake. And so if you wanna get to the light rail station, for example, you can just be like, hey, pick me up. And they
That's
tell
cool.
you what corner to go to, and then they, yeah, it's very cool,
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
yeah.
Okay.
And the parking minimums for this, I think I asked some previous meeting. Does that come from ADA or is that coming from building, city code or state or?
So sure. So for the amount of ADA spaces, is that what you mean? Or
in
just
general,
all
like,
spaces?
That 22.
Oh, okay, so there's a bunch of things that play into that number. So it is depending on the uses, it all follows the ITE methodology, which is for parks and recreation space, it's for like area of the park plus gathering space within the park. And then for structures, it's often the occupancy or it's the occupancy plus use. So for example, if if it's an office, you need to have a space, they assume for an employee. So it's all of those things because we have a multi-use park kind of combined together. And so that rationale and that math is all presented in the traffic impact analysis report.
But that's generated for local permitting or?
Well, so yes, it's generated as a design guidance, but then typically local permitting will require that a traffic study is done and that whatever you're proposing is supported by the traffic impact analysis. So it's, sometimes one follows the other more strongly. In this case, we started our design and said parking is an inevitability. We will need to have some parking at this park and included a traffic person on the team so that they could start looking at it so that we wouldn't propose a park with, wildly too much parking or wildly not enough parking and kind of try to get the design as close as possible. And so what we, with the schematic design, we had basically a full row of accessible parking spaces. Because at that point, we weren't really sure what we were going to be required from an accessibility standpoint to have. And so we always knew that if we were less than, you know, what we showed on the plan in terms of requirement, then those 2 other spaces or those 3 other spaces could be converted to additional load unload parking, which is where we are. So we, based on that study, we're looking at 3 ADA spaces. And so we're still working out, it's probably gonna be 1 van and 2 standard accessible spaces. So we may be able to shrink the footprint slightly of those 3 and then gain at least 2, potentially 3 additional regular spaces into the design. But sometimes that happens as we get further into 70%. We have not had our pre-application meeting with the city yet, but that's one of the things that's kind of the next step. And in that discussion, usually the city or the, you know, regulatory agency, the municipality will provide in the memo a statement that says what the requirement is based on what you submitted with, you know, a rationale saying this is what's defensible, this is what our traffic consultant said, this is what we're including in the plan. And then we would get a response from the city that that's acceptable, not acceptable, needs to be refined, those types of things. So it's still a conversation. We're still at half design. So we're expecting half, you know, of the design work to still be coming, and it's all refinements like that. Yeah. Okay, so in our 50% plans preparation, so we basically take, you know, what was an illustration, it was an informed illustration based on the site constraints, and then we create the beginning of construction documents. So, you know, before it was generally this, you know, generally this is the turn radius, etc. Now it's the turn radius is exactly 22.5 feet. And it's those because, you know, that might be the accessibility guidance, or it might be the emergency vehicle egress. So we really dial it into, okay, now I have a ramp that's 29.5 feet and it's, you know, 2.5 feet tall. And so where does that meet with my stairs? And how many stairs does that become? So it's the process of taking an illustration and kind of making it really, really feasible. So as we go through that, it means that we're coordinating where those different pieces meet up, and it means that we're refining costs based on what was schematic and then what is, you know, more likely to be actual, and then continually refining those in. So our next step is to provide, the team right now is working on their updates. We'll be providing our draft plan set to Corey for review, likely the first week of October. And then the other part of this is the state and federal permitting. So this is the design development step. So the items that are being completed as part of this are things like the critical areas report, the biological evaluation. This is a required report for the Army Corps of Engineers that talks about the biological conditions of the shoreline, looks at things like, are there endangered species present? In our case, yes, you know, there's an endangered salmon run in this area, some listed species. So NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, this is something that, because this project is likely to receive federal funding, we're required to do. So it's a kind of an in-depth permitting process that looks at a bunch of different facets of environmental protection. The JARPA, this is the Joint Aquatic Resources Permit. This is a necessary state permit, and is it's a bit of a streamlined permitting process between the state and feds. But anyway, so we're working on that, and then the pre-application submittal package. So that's kind of the first step in our local permitting. So all of these things will include the 50% documents, and then they'll include those supplemental studies. So this is a pretty tedious and dry part of the project, but it is a very necessary step that kind of sets the stage for, you know, dramatically advancing the design and starting the clock on some of these permit processes, which is important. Okay, so in terms of our design development progress, as mentioned, we'll go through and kind of apply like real world dimensions and conditions to everything. We start looking more specifically at materials. So for example, we may have thought, you know, concrete, brick, now it's more like, you know, this concrete with a broom swept pattern. And so we're really refining it down. And are we talking 2-inch or 4-inch slabs so that we can actually get a little bit closer to what the actual construction might be? And then in terms of constructability, we start looking at things like, how is the sequence of construction going to happen? Like, for example, we know that we've got some efficiencies that can be gained by the fact that this location on the lake has 2 work windows. So rather than just having a 2-week or 1-month period in the summer, we've got a little bit of a longer time period over the course of the winter where we can actually be in the lake on the shoreline doing work. So our initial phasing of the project looked mainly at those 2 windows and at availability of funding. But now it's looking more at things like, you know, if we have an excavator on site and they're doing this work, can they also do this other piece? And then that will make that project go faster, those types of things. We also look at value engineering. So value engineering techniques, for example, if our structural team needs a certain type of concrete and our civil team needs a certain type of concrete, if they spec the same type of concrete, it comes in one truck and there's sort of one crew. If they spec slightly different mixes, then it means that we've got 2 trucks and that's got to be orchestrated. So can we make it cheaper and get the same project by specifying, you know, one mix and having those 2 things done at one time? So we're going through all of that exercise in terms of coordinating the different disciplines as well. And then based on our, you know, measurements from the construction drawings, we'll go through that cost estimation update. Okay, so that's where we are with design development, moving rapidly ahead. In terms of milestones for the project coming up, we are planning for the next community workshop. So we've set the date for this with the city. This is Wednesday, October 16th. It'll be in City Hall like the others were. We're going to do a hybrid format again. So this will be in person, but then there'll be kind of a recap of everything that was in the in-person exercises online so that members of the public who aren't able to attend the meeting in person or anything like that, they can still participate in the process. So the exercises that we have queued up for the public that we're hoping to engage them in is basically about placemaking. So we've been talking a lot about park construction. You heard probably too much from me about park construction and park permitting, but this idea of, you know, what is a park and where does a park get its personality? That starts to become some of the design that starts to come out once we have kind of the rough skeleton and framework of that design work done. Now we get to start thinking about, you know, what does the railing feel like when you touch it? What is the, you know, the shadow that's cast from, you know, the guardrail or railing to the patio? What does the deck start to look like? Is there, you know, different types of, is there a theme to the play equipment? What's the finish on the benches that starts to make you feel like you're, you know, at the shoreline or in Lake Forest Park or any of these interesting things that we really want people to know about this park? That comes through some of this construction detailing. So we want the public's input and we want to continue to engage them in this process. And so in terms of where we are now, we haven't actually taken the schematic design visuals, which I know most of you guys have seen from the schematic design document and then from presentation to council. We haven't actually shown those to the public in terms of saying these are them. They, you know, the information is online, they can find it if they want, but we're going to use this workshop 3 to present those visuals. They'll be slightly updated. You'll see some of the design updates that I'll show you as we move to 50%. And then we want to remind them about basically the interpretive planning process, the interpretive planning exercise that we did. So this was during phase 1, talking to stakeholders and stakeholder groups, representatives of different interests around the park and its history. And then what was the central theme that came out of those discussions when people were talking about what this park is, what this park should be. So I wanted to reread some of those. So basically, in terms of the first part of the community workshop is going to be to reiterate and kind of reintroduce those interpretive planning themes. So the central theme that came out of the work with the interpretive planning committee was this shoreline offers space for reciprocal exchanges that restore the whole watershed and the lives connected to it. So this came out of themes and then individual stories. So the themes were reconciliation work begins by acknowledging past damage done to communities and ecosystems connected to this site. And some of the stories that we heard about that were things like, you know, what was this area before the lake was lowered? What were the, you know, fish that were here, the kokanee that were present in the stream before the stream was changed? And how there was also, it was shared with us, you know, why keep some of these buildings? And what we heard from the community, what we heard from the council, and what we heard from you guys was that there have been other old buildings in Lake Forest Park that have been lost. And this is an opportunity to save some. We can't save all, but we can save some. And that's important in terms of documenting, you know, some of the historical character of Lake Forest Park. And that some of the intention is about bringing the community together. And so this, you know, reconciliation and, or sorry, reciprocal exchanges to better the lives connected to it. This is about people getting together and gathering together. You know, that's really what the intent of this park is. And I think there's much more that we could have done to program the park to say, this is specifically this area. This is specifically this. But what we have really is a lot of flexible spaces. We've got a flexible big house, a flexible small cabin. We have a flexible lawn space. We have, flexible trails and paths, and it's all about allowing the community to grow with the space and use the space for those reciprocal exchange connections between community members and community groups, and using it in different contexts. So in terms of why the design looks like it is, that's why I think it's important to remind about these themes. So that the second theme was, by better understanding the natural systems connected to the shoreline, people can restore those systems to more self-sufficient conditions. Current restoration strategies, including shoreline buffering and enhancement for fish passage, are bringing back the wildlife community. And then the supporting stories to that included things like the historical kokanee run. A lot of people in the interpretive planning session and some of the individuals in the community also mentioned things like Indigenous place naming, or incorporating messages about Indigenous use of this area prior to settlement. So in terms of these themes, this doesn't define the park specifically. What this means is, when we have the opportunity to do a little bit more, what's the message that should be the reminder? And so for the design team standpoint, it should be something that furthers these goals that came out of that introspection and working with the community stakeholders and with community members. Okay, so using that as sort of a launch point, we'll share the schematic design visuals, and that's going to be presenting basically the updated site plan and then the visual renderings in a large format. So as part of that, once we say, here's what the design is looking like, we're going to ask these questions with a survey and with likely a written, there's a written format one as well. So how do you think the park will benefit the community of Lake Forest Park? What comes to mind when you think about the future lakefront? How does the design make you feel? And then how does the design align with your expectations and values? And so in terms of, this is really our opportunity to say, here's where we are. Did we get it right? We're still early enough that we can make changes and refinements. And so if we're continuing in the right direction, we do have, as part of this design scope, creating some interpretive elements to suit the park. We're not going to create so many that it looks like Disney World, kind of, every other corner there's a sign, there's an exhibit, but more subtle. Are there things, inscribed in the benches? Are there things? So Tualadees Park was mentioned early on in the project as a site that did this well. So the interpretation there are, inscriptions in the banisters. It's prints in the concrete, but they echo the theme of the nature of the place. And so that's really what we're talking about here in terms of, where does the community want to see those? What should those look like? Can play be incorporated? And that was definitely something that's in those kind of, you break down those themes further and you get into some storytelling. So a scavenger hunt of sort of natural symbols and elements was talked about. There were a lot of really good ideas that came out of direct engagement with the public, that we want to make sure that we're still bringing the public along and, hearing what the public says and getting their feedback early on. So this is the site plan in its more updated format. So a couple changes that you'll see here are things like, mouse is moving pretty slowly. Okay. Let's see. So what is different here? Okay. This little overlook platform was a little bit closer to the shoreline. In order to keep a tree, we moved it back. This one also was a little bit here. In order to keep a tree, we moved it over. We also reduced the size of this one after we got the refined geometry back for the wetlands. So we've got a couple little subtle tweaks there. The size of the playground is slightly changed, this basically arc of this loop, in order to create this path alignment so that it aligns better to actually create a water view, and so that we can get an ADA compliant slope to the sidewalk. So these are the sort of little refinements that are very, very necessary, but they don't change the design. So one other thing we've refined, the width of this, so you'll see the parking lot layout. What we think we can do is reduce this drive aisle, scoot these two down, and then scoot this down slightly. We'll have a clear path for the emergency vehicle, and then this will probably be 3 spaces. But again, that's the sort of refinement and tweaking that we do once we're in the drawings rather than doing it in the concept. And we did investigate how this staging area is going to work. So, how do people bring something in? Where is the air station located? Luckily, and this was something that I actually just learned as part of this process, my, the kind of deputy project manager and the one who's choreographing some of the, plan orchestration across disciplines, she used to work for a kayak outfitter. And so she was like, oh no, we need like this sort of, like, this is you're thinking of the wrong stand, we need this sort of stand. So she's been doing some design exercises to make sure that we can get an emergency vehicle back, that the pump is located in the right spot, all of that, those things. So we're doing those little exercises as a design team. Couple things, this area that was previously basically, between those two structures is very, very close. And so we were thinking, is it a hidey hole, which you want to avoid in any sort of park and public space? So we had thought, okay, well, we'll gate it and it can be outdoor storage for equipment and things. Now it actually feels like it's the right dimensions for some of the mechanical for the buildings to live. And so that will be basically in a, kind of locked fence that's between those two buildings. It was going to have its door where it was facing the bathroom door. And then actually we can save a tree by moving it around. And so then it's really just, you don't need to be in that corner because that's maintenance. And then this is the bathroom door and the tree stays. So a lot of those fun exercises of like really drilling into how these things are going to work are what happened once we get into the 50% design. Okay. So here's our renderings, or here are our renderings. And I'm not sure, has everyone seen these?
Not the color ones, just the like the hand drawn.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay. Yeah, so these are our, updated renderings. So these will be on basically the very large panel as a screen. They'll be in a slightly different layout. These are kind of snippets from the schematic design document. But they'll be blown up and we'll have some on boards around the room. We'll have some on a rotating slideshow, and then we'll have the QR code for people to be scanning and giving their feedback via the survey. So this shows that parking configuration when we were thinking that it could be ADA all the way across. So we're making edits now to some of these renderings to update them based on the refined site plan.
So maybe I tipped out this schematic design, or I sent it out in a long email and so I will send out a link after this to the schematic.
Okay. This is a fun view. This is the view basically if you're, walking into the park off of the path, and this will be basically looking straight down where the existing fence line is. And so on your left-hand side is basically the back wall of the garage that's been converted into the restroom. And on the right side, the right edge of the path is essentially where the preserve path is now. But those two have been kind of combined to be the front approach to the bathroom. And then you've got the ramp that comes up to the waterfront view of the deck right in front of you. And you can see the picnic shelter right behind that. And then curving down the path where the 4 is, that will take you around to the waterfront and to the dock as well.
That's the one in the bottom left corner, right? Yeah.
F,
That would be the,
yeah,
okay.
right there from F. So view G is this one. So this would be actually, taking that first right turn and sitting on one of these overlooks. So in this picture, when we have these blown up at the video, you'll see a little bit better, but I don't know if you can tell. So these individuals are actually on the bridge that is now relocated from the one area of the park so that it connects to the existing overlook. And so they're standing basically right here. And so you can see them across the floodplain vegetation. They're standing on the bridge.
Can you point to them in that picture G again?
Oh,
sorry.
sure. Let me go
I
back.
think we got it.
You see these guys?
Yeah, okay.
Right there, yeah. So we're basically standing on the corner of this overlook platform and looking out across the floodplain, and so you can catch sight of the bridge, kind of far across. Okay.
I heard you correctly, this is 3 plots now, not 2. Was that more of like a bare bulk zoning than anything?
Well, so I basically when Lion Creek Waterfront Preserve had been there, and that was the only bit of public shoreline. But it didn't have water access. And so then the city acquired the other 2 parcels next to it, which is the basically effectively programmed as 1 parcel, but 2 tax lots. And when we started doing the project, it was, okay, so we're gonna create a new park next to our existing park.
Gotcha, okay.
And, right, and then it became, well, how does that work? And does that make sense? And in terms of, 20 years from now, are people gonna say the park next to the other park?
Yeah,
Right, it's one park and they're gonna know it as one park. And so by actually kind of taking a step back and looking at everything together, I think we were able to come up with a really rich plan that responds to both. And I think one of the key components of this project is that, right now, the preserve is really pressed for people wanting to be in there. But it's a really sensitive spot.
Yeah.
This community cares about its creeks. That's very apparent from how much, the community knows about it, how much we hear about it at the community meetings, how many of the neighbors are well informed about, the watershed and the basin and the creek and the salmon runs and things. And so by looking at all three in concert, there really isn't a reason to crowd that tiny creek to get people around both sides of it. And taking a step back means that we've got, a little bit more space for the creek. It makes sense from a permitting standpoint in terms of retreating out of one sensitive area so that we can focus the recreational activity on the new parcel. And it does give a little bit more of a buffer between this use and the Civic Club, which I know is part of the conversation. So, yes, so it's 3, but when we scoped for the first phase of the project, we asked for a cultural resources report of 2 properties. And so they didn't even look at that, right?
so it still honors all of the original commitments that are.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. It actually maintains better the hearing examiner's conditions because it does leave access slightly further out from actually the creek banks, the creek channel that is currently provided. Okay. So here's the play area. So this is sitting on that expanded deck and then looking out across the play area. So the 2 large trees that are in this frame, this is one of those kind of fun nerdy construction facts, but the two trees that are in the frame, those are the existing trees that are out there. The way that this is going to be constructed is essentially the path that goes around those trees will essentially form like a little bit of a curb or almost like a swimming pool sort of around them. And so we'll hold the trees at their existing location, their existing grade. We'll have the curb around them, and then the entire thing will be basically filled with wood chip. So playground wood chip. So we'll still have free, clear draining around the root zones of those trees. The bamboo, the invasive bamboo that's there is going to be pulled out. There's some really cool rhododendron in that area that we want to keep, but we just want to prune them up a little bit so the kids can actually get underneath. I don't know if you've been under those, but they're pretty neat in terms of their structure. So all of that will stay, the 2 trees will stay, and then we're sizing the playground equipment to basically fit below those lower boughs that sort of frame that view. So that's all been measured out, and so we're working with looking at some different styles of playground equipment to make sure that it fits in that space. So here is being on the other side of the path and looking through the structure. And then here are some views of the interior of the structure. So this lowest view is looking from the entrance sidewalk kind of across cabin 6. So you can see that most of it is open with windows. This is showing it programmed as an office, but as we've mentioned, the use of that building is going to be flexible use, whatever the city decides to use it for. Office has been discussed, but that use could change. However the city wants to operate it, is essentially the way that that will be operated. And then the top 2 are showing the interiors of the structure. So in this case, this view is actually showing maintaining that second fireplace on the far wall. But in terms of the structural discussion about the home, it is entirely possible that that second fireplace may need to come out. But the main grand fireplace that's in the center of the structure, that is notable, that would definitely stay. Construction wise, it may be far cheaper in the re-engineering of this wall, that's part of an addition to the house that was done in the 1960s. It may be wiser to take that fireplace out. So, okay, the second one, not the main. Okay, and then so this is the picnic pavilion with our porch swing, and so that's we've made some subtle tweaks to that, but anyway, the design is still continuing. And then here is our dock. So our dock has been primarily engineered. It's kind of, because it's what we're submitting for our shoreline permits, they work up to almost like 80% complete drawings. Those get submitted. everybody spends the next like 6 months catching up to where they are, and then they rejoin for the update to 100%. Okay, and so here we have our beach view.
Active park.
Yes. So it is a well-loved passive use. Okay, yes,
I just know that I got a lot of feedback on the playground.
yes.
Will there be more of a, like, will there be a place where we could have elementary school kids try to be part of the design for that in some way, or?
Oh, that's an
like,
interesting one. In terms of selecting the equipment,
or laying things out, or,
yeah, we'll have to think about that. So the, in terms of a general selection of the look, yes, we can look at doing something like that in workshop 4. So when we are, or as a separate engagement exercise, Corey, if you want to do something like that, or we can set up an engagement activity to take to fairs if you think that like events, if you think that that's a good place for that. So this is a public project. And so I don't know if you guys are well versed in kind of public capital projects, but in a public project, we're not allowed to basically say, you know, you have to specify a Honda for this. So you have to get a Honda car. We have to say you need to buy it like a mid-size sedan with 4 doors, and then there's competition, right? So there's competition inherent in the process. And so as much as we could say, we want a playground that has these characteristics and does this, we can't actually say it's this playground, but this vendor. And so in that way, there is an element of expectation managing with kids. We could talk about materials, themes, core elements. We could do some sort of rough, you know, sketching of what the design would be, but short of the city basically purchasing the playground ahead of time and then telling the contractor install the playground that we already have. It is difficult to specify a set product. So that would be the only thing that I would want to be careful with in terms of.
and I assume it would be
engaging
more
them
on the
into
level
kids.
of, what are the games you would want to be able to play in this space?
Okay,
Or at least the activities, you know,
like slide, no slide, climber, no climber, that sort of
Right,
stuff.
and,
Absolutely,
you know,
yeah.
I know that,
Mhm.
and I think you heard this too, that, like, people looking at some of the early drawings and like, those are the
Yes.
games, which I know is just, it's not a criticism. I know that you heard that all the
Right.
time, it was more just like, you need to
Right,
mask the space. But
yeah,
as it gets closer to actually like picking a design for it, I'm
yes,
just wondering if there will be ways that we can.
Yeah.
especially take something to a classroom or a PTA event or something like that.
Yeah.
and get focused.
yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think so. The feedback from, we got a lot of comments about this, that was a real playground is needed. You know, something that's just like a couple boulders or a couple like log steppers is not a playground. And so in terms of the photos that I selected, so blame is well placed. It was about materials in terms of,
Yeah.
you know, are we looking for like Tonka toy style big plastic? Are we looking for wood? Are we looking for really, really natural? And it sounded like, you know, more natural is preferred, but we need a bigger playground. And so the cost proposal, that's where the value is being able to get something that is the kids can play on for a time and enjoy multiple times, and it serves multiple ages. And so that's
year.
definitely, yes. So that's definitely what's shown here in terms of still something using, we found several vendors that do more robust playground equipment with a more log, you know, natural looking construction. So rather than having, you know, large plastic green plinths or something, it does have a little bit more of a style that would blend into some of the other finishes in the park. And it's cost competitive. And several of these are local vendors because of us being in an area where there is, you know, timber and all of these things, which are great. So the other trick to public projects is that you can't say, you know, you need to buy this specific product just generically, but it only describes one. That you have to have, like a contractor can actually challenge that specification if you're sort of overly exclusionary in terms of the options that you provided for them to come with different product ranges. And so the fact that we've been able to find several vendors that meet those criteria, it's looking good for us to choose from an array of options, get a good, robust, but also cost-effective playground. The other thing that we did in terms of what we heard from the community early on, and then what we did in the next round for the schematic design, is we just full on increased the cost of the line item for the playground. So where we had initially assumed, I think, 100,000, I think we doubled that and just said, you know, this is something the community really needs. So for cost planning purposes, we should plan for a more expensive playground because it means more playground. And so in that way, it does mean that we've got, you know, as we go through and we kind of tune all the cost knobs down for this project, there is some room to refine that, but that's what we did pretty much across the board in terms of saying, what's the planning number? You know, the worst thing that we can do is give the city a planning number so that they don't ask for enough funding or try to find enough funding in the first place. And so we gave a, you know, you want solar panels? Great, put them in. You want the bigger playground? Great, put it in. And that's the number that we came up with. And so there's some room to tweak the design down. And the goal would be, as we do that forward, we get feedback from this committee, from the council on which knobs are okay to turn and how much. Right, and the playground knob might be one of those that we don't turn down at all, you know.
And I know when I've been at St. Edward's, there's signage, I don't know what the cost effective look like,
Mhm.
but that playground, it talks about it having been designed by local kids and
Very cool.
there may have been some sweat equity from
Mhm.
local kids also, but I
Yeah,
don't know what that process looked like or if there's anything.
Yeah. I can check that out.
Within all of those. districts. I believe that that's the largest playground in.
The state, yeah, it's huge.
Really?
It's really cool.
Oh, wow. I should go over there. With my 4.5-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she'll be jazzed.
It's-
Okay.
You need
That's
to
great.
discover paths.
We've got one. Okay, so that concludes my update in terms of prepared remarks. Thank you guys. I know it's been a while since I've been here, and so getting you kind of up to speed about where we are and where we're going. You know, I'm glad to have that opportunity, and thanks for the input. So are there any questions or anything? Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's such incredible work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The question is about the themes that were presented.
Mhm.
My memory is that there's, kind of feels like there's maybe some conflicting or sort of like different sort of motivations for this park that don't need to be at cross purposes, but sometimes seem like they are. And one is really like the restoration crowd and the other is like the recreation crowd.
Mhm.
And I know that you guys are working really hard to make sure that both are present, but in the themes, I didn't see a lot of humans. The lives thing was beautiful, but then in the two sub themes, it seemed to be both really focused on sort of like historical, like. and like
University and natural history.
yeah, natural
Yeah.
history. And so one thing I'm thinking about is opportunities for people to give feedback on that. I know we have a workshop coming up. I also know that a lot of younger families just don't make it to those workshops. And so I'm wondering if there's an opportunity, whatever kind of feedback you're gonna be gathering at that workshop, are there ways that we can support, like getting that into PTAs or
Mhm.
like pushing it out to different demographics that might not be able to offer feedback? That's a lot in one question, but I'm just.
No,
thinking
that's
about, like,
it's
how to make sure
The
that
survey.
people.
Yeah, but they'll be doing a
It's
survey
good
and
to
the
see.
open house will all be online for the week.
Okay.
So once Amber and our team has it up, we can give you guys that information. You can start blasting.
so. Here again. Okay. Share.
And that would be also in the regular distribution channels for the city.
Yep, we'll be going on all the platforms.
So-
you can share.
Here's our interpretive, here's our interpretive plan. And this is on the website, and so you can take a look at it there, and it's got, you know, more about project site context, and then some of the process, you know, some of the work that was done, looking at that, and then the themes and sub-themes are, so this was kind of a neat one, because this looks, basically the consolidation of mission. So, you know, the city of Lake Forest Park has its mission, the Lake Forest Park Stewardship Foundation has its mission, the PRAB has a mission, and there's the city's charter for compassion. And so in kind of combining and coalescing all of those things together, the statement came out to create and maintain a space for reciprocal exchanges that restore the whole watershed and the lives connected to it. And then in terms of how that translates into the use of the property, it really became about what the shoreline itself and use of the shoreline is. So there's a number of kind of strategies and more information in this. And so I definitely think last time we did a survey, we sent the questions to Corey, and I think she ran them by this board, right? So we can do that again. And so I think in terms of looking at, we'll definitely want to make sure that we're putting them in a framework that I'm telling the whole story. And so if presenting that sort of theme to sub-theme, rather than starting from the storytelling up, is misrepresenting, or I guess not telling the whole story about where the themes came from, then that's definitely something that we would want to refine. And so I think this document, I think there's really good information in this document in terms of bringing together all of those pieces that are kind of contributing to the messaging. And if there's some message that we didn't get that wasn't represented in here, then adding it and revising the plan so that it can effectively guide the interpretive work and then the placemaking work, I think would be really important. So I think that's a great, point.
And I feel like I don't, man, I do so much work and where there's like one squeaky wheel that is not representative, so I don't wanna be that person, but I just, when I look at behavioral goals. I'm like wondering why use is in quotes. These are all like very peaceful and I'm like, where, I'm thinking about like the relationship between this park and the other beach clubs, and that basically we're saying like, okay, if you belong to a private beach club, you can be rowdy and play in a beachfront park, but if you go to this park, you need to meditate. Yeah.
Well, the preserve will give that.
Yeah.
Still,
Mhm.
and the other side will be that recreation.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
So I think
There
it's
is
not
gonna be
taking
both.
away. I just
No,
wanna
but
make
it may
sure
be that there was a recreational theme or, a recreational advocacy that didn't rise as strongly as it maybe should have in terms of the crafting of these messaging. So I know the use comment was based on our communication with some representatives of the tribes in terms of use but not commodify, in terms of belonging to a place but also serving that place in the way that the place belongs to you, you belong to it, it serves you, you serve it. So that was part of the reciprocal exchanges in terms of, and the word reciprocity was really their kind of word in terms of like, how can this be reciprocal in terms of not just using the landscape, like using it up, but using the landscape in a way that you grow with it and it grows with you. So I think that's why the quotes are there. But that I completely understand that without that backstory, it seems odd to have quotes around the word use.
I also, a lot of people, when they hear recreation, they hear ball fields, like, and which is not, and there's not like a motorboat launch, like I understand that it's different. And
Well, they're all boat launches, there's a playground, like.
Yeah, and there will be a lot of people who come to this park without necessarily thinking about the restoration goals that it also accomplishes. And so I think in terms of that would be the lift, right? Is catching someone's attention for long enough to say, did you know that Kokanee used to be here? Like that sort of thing. And so I think that's great in terms of, play, recreation, and really the human component being effectively represented in the messaging and in the language.
And I think that is what makes Bonnie Creek Park a very special park compared to the parks that are existing around, like Rhododendron, Log Boom, the Beach Club, because it has that conservation component. And it's not just about being in a park and recreating. You're in nature, you are in a space where salmon restoration is being actively pursued. So I think it makes that park essentially unique and makes it all the more special because we as a community pride ourselves as a community that cares for the environment. We're extremely protective of our trees, and we want to make sure that we are protecting nature for the next generation.
And kids want a playground.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, have
And
you
give the water.
guys talked about park naming?
We have not yet.
Okay.
But don't you?
Yeah. Can you slide on that?
I don't, but I,
add that even though kids want to play, kids do want to preserve nature. I ask my kids specifically that, do you want a playground or do you want to save, to conserve and make sure that salmon comes back? And he said he was adamant, he wants orcas to keep their food. So
That's
he's
great.
willing to sacrifice a big.
But this part will show that you can do both, so.
And I think,
Yeah.
Alex, to your point, in the emotional goal, there's also the feel a sense of peace and relaxation in areas with other spots or at certain times, splashes of excitement and thrill. It suggests a particular balance of relaxation and recreation that you may want to find different people in there.
Okay,
And that's spread over the space too, right?
Right, right,
Places Where it's always, it's not at some times, that's what it's for.
right.
And there are places where it shouldn't spill over. I think that's the interesting challenge you guys
Yeah,
handle very nicely.
well, and I think the balance is pretty neat in terms of this, the park and the effort. And I don't necessarily see anything in this language about how important it is to acknowledge both and to balance both. There's what do they say, the two-pronged mission, if you're too heavily weighted in one and not doing the other, you're not fulfilling the two-pronged mission. And so I think in terms of, play and recreation as well as conservation and protection, I would see as the kind of balance elements here. Okay, I think that's great in terms of looking for feedback. And was there anything else in the interpretive? Maybe that's part of the question is, in some of our interpretive work that's going to guide placemaking, we did these exercises, this is the language that's there. Is anything missing? And kind of probing the public in that way and see what needs to be added.
Yeah, is there anything to do with the naming piece where you're talking about, you have two parks that you're creating this sort of kind of seamless sort of design experience, but you have two parks next to each other, one that'll have a different name than the other. Is there something to be like leveraged with that?
Yeah, we'll work on that.
I don't mean like the name piece of it, but like
Right.
just that, like not confusing people that you have a park next to a park.
Mhm.
And then like how is there like a synergy that you can create that like by like the communication of recreation and conservation?
Mhm.
And is it told through those two, like a park next to a park?
Yeah,
Or come in with one name for both.
Yeah, I can see
That's-
us renaming this area and you have
And
the
having
preserve
Preserve
and
with the same name.
yes.
I
Like
wasn't
keeping
sure
the
how to-
preserve
yeah.
maybe and just kind of, but maybe there'll be a different name for the entire park area.
The
So
whole
like-
park is one thing.
something.
And then
Maybe we have
just
the
the preserve.
preserve
Part of
side.
Yeah.
The lakeside, however.
Yeah, that's a good thought. It's like park and preserve, but the same. I mean, if you're
Mm-hmm.
striving to have like a continuity across it.
Right, I think the very real thing that the public won't be able to see is that there is a line where the rules are different because of the hearing examiner's conditions. And so it is definitely part of the storytelling about how the it was single family residential, two houses, basically. The city acquired the Lion Creek parcel as the first part of the story and made it a preserve because it's that important. And then when they had the opportunity to kind of come in and redo and add more of a park, they actually, I don't want to say expanded the preserve, but preserved more of the preserve because it's that important, right? And so I think in terms of, the narrative of this whole thing, it is that acknowledgement of how important it is to be able to safely and legally recreate without feeling like you're sneaking onto the shoreline in your own city, and then also be next to this really important conservation piece. And I think, there's a quality of life thing that Lake Forest Park does really well in terms of acknowledging what's important and acknowledging what's important. And then having those two things coupled together in a way that, you know, I think this park is about in a lot of ways. So, yeah, naming is not in my scope. I believe it's, I don't know if it's the role of this body or, yes,
Role.
Yeah.
And,
so.
Yeah, so start.
I mean, ultimately, the council, vote like. this,
Yeah,
but
with
we
recommendations.
Suggested.
Yeah.
Process.
Yes.
My question is about scheduling, will the closure be in phases, or when you start constructing the whole,
Mhm.
park will be closed, including Lion Creek?
The preserve will have to be closed during some of the construction, yes.
But some of the construction, so, it will be in portions of it will be left open.
Well, so that would be, so that's an interesting question, because of, if we go back, let's see, well,
When you start your demolition of the cabins, well,
This early work.
So,
Stuff.
right, the early work won't happen on Lion Creek at all. But once we actually get into full park construction, I think it would be very difficult to keep the preserve open through the construction of the 3 properties,
The
yeah,
dock will be putting out and the bridge is moving around.
right, exactly.
There's no barrier anymore, right?
The fence is coming down, yeah.
Right, well, so the hearing examiner's conditions do say that the park is supposed to be secured. And so there will be a fence on the new park. That's, you know, been a component of the design, because there's just really no way to fence off only that area if you're not fencing off the whole thing. And so, it is I think the phasing and opening during construction would be an ongoing conversation, but I think if we can imagine what's gonna happen with the preserve parcel, that side, you know, there's gonna be a new sidewalk construction down the whole road. The trail right now that comes off of Beach Drive and goes to the bridge, basically, that trail is gonna be restored and pulled out. The bridge is gonna move. And so the only way to get onto, you know, the preserved parcel will be through the connecting paths through the main park. And so there won't actually be a space for anybody to walk around in that park until the full park is open, until the full preserve is open. Or the full park and preserve is open, and then you'll be able to get into the preserve via the new paths. So I think if construction stays on time, we can get the full construction done in that one window of, you know, likely in 18 months of construction, then that would be the duration of the closure for basically both properties.
It might be a good thing to add to the timeline, of the different things that we have, right?
Yeah.
That park would be closed. Because that's a resource that the
Mhm.
community has, and be good to get in front of that.
They'll probably have to be closed for the summer.
Yeah,
And announcements ahead of that would be
Mhm.
appreciated,
Yeah, of
because
course.
we've noticed, a lot more people are using Lime Creek now. In the past 2 years than we've seen in prior to that.
really.
So it's like, it used to be this unknown gem
Mhm.
that very few in the community know about. Even in the community, very few know about it.
Mhm.
So, but now it's like, okay, everybody knows, and they are coming and using Lion Creek.
Oh, neat,
Yeah.
cool.
And you may get asked about this, and it may be that this winds up without getting coordinated, but I know the Civic Club is, for years, have been talking about dredging out along the beach there,
Mhm.
and if somehow, like, people will probably ask you if the timing somehow aligns, is it possible to like line that work up with whatever's happening with this? And as it gets closer to actually happening, people will start wondering.
Right,
So, I'm not assuming that you have the answer now, but it may be something to.
Yeah, I think you're right, they will ask about it, somebody will wanna know.
Yeah.
Well, if you're gonna build there, we wanna dredge, like, let's all do it.
right, I think there's a,
It's probably not the same contractors, it's probably not the same. permits,
no, and the
work,
permits
but-
would be the really big thing, yeah, the permits would be the really big thing, there,
Dredging is very expensive. I will just say it's very expensive and I don't think in our scope. The preview.
Right.
And then.
Maybe even that'd be fine to say, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're not covering dredging
Right,
for this.
it's also for use of this property and for this, the salmon bearing stream that it is. Dredging is not an activity that you would need to do to build this park, you know, or to use this park, or as a restoration measure in any way for the creek itself. So there have definitely been conversations with the Civic Club about the two projects working together in terms of you know, coordinating their neighbors, share a property line. You know, if the fencing, what are we doing with the fencing? What are we doing with the planting? Those types of things. But there's also acknowledgement, you know, that there's a property owner on one side and a property owner on the other. And so in that way, I think the Civic Club's interest in, and I don't want to speak for them in any way, but some of their interest was just in the shallowness of the bathing beach. And, you know, yeah, and that would be, you know, separate from sort of swimming areas and things at this beach. So I wouldn't see any advantages to, especially the permitting, but then also to the construction of kind of dovetailing those works. But that would be an interesting question. And I'm glad that you asked it now so that I have time to noodle on it.
Thanks, Neil.
Concise answer, yeah. If that does come out. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, that was helpful.
Kind of thinking it over as I'm saying it. Okay, so we have in this scope for phase 2, we have the community workshop now, and then we've got an additional community workshop that we're planning for May. And so we'll have an updated cost estimate, 70% complete design, so much more complete then. And so in terms of the engagement with the public, we'll be talking way more about construction impacts, what we're looking like, where we stand with funding, how the park will be closed, where, you know, we're maybe making some choices at that point about, you know, equipment, playground, stuff like that. We could also, just putting this out there, if the community, if the Parks and Rec Board wants to use the community meeting that happens in the spring to engage the community in a naming exercise, just let us know. And that's definitely something that we can feature, you know, if you want. I know when Whispering Willow Park was named, I think there was a survey that went out.
To
voting.
survey, we'll have to chat and see how we wanna.
Yeah.
This one though, cause
It's a little different.
different.
Yeah, with the existing one and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, if there's anything that we can do as part of this process to kind of capture everybody when they're in the same room, or, you know, post it to the project website, if there's other things like that.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, then we can use any of those channels to further that work. Okay,
That was in May.
May is where it is on the timeline, yeah, so we haven't selected a date
Yeah.
that I could, yeah,
Just
but
ballpark.
the goal. So this was the breakdown further of the storytelling in here. And yeah, I think so the sub themes under C1, let's see. Yeah, there's not really a good story about play. And just being, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be present.
And there's nothing to say that that can't tie in with some of these themes, right?
Oh, sure.
Because just people live here and they play here, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think lives and connection, gathering, using parks and park space as a way of fostering community relationships, I think it could actually be a theme 3 as part of sort of the storytelling that's present. And I think some of that would be you know, historically, this park was built in the 1920s, and it did have or not the park was built, but the buildings were started building in the 1920s, and this was a place where people came to play. They came to play on the shoreline, so it was cool and it was neat. And yeah, I think there is a theme missing. So
That
thank
was
you.
all the way to the speaking beats and that.
So the postcards are from the different phases that I haven't forgotten to bring to a meeting, but take 2 of these ones and then 1 of the other options. I'll save some for
The
Amy
second one,
and Josh and some.
Right, so that one with the kind of funny cartoon on the front, that was actually what we brought, to the interview for the project. So before we had an idea of what this could look like, it was thinking about, if it were already done and you were writing yourself a postcard from the new completed park, and so now we have updated them with some of the visuals for the second part of the project.
That's cool.
Okay,
There are 3 different ones altogether, is that what you're saying?
Oh, no, so
Or are there?
there, the new batch, there's multiple ones, but you get to choose one of those. The old one, you can take 2 of those.
Oh my God, actually, it was with that too.
No, you have the old one, so we're waiting for some.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Which one's the old ones? These?
So, yeah.
You came pretty close.
I know, right?
Yeah,
okay, so I am going to, I'll send the link for the interpretive plan to Corey so that can be shared with this group. And so then that way, it'll be like a little bit fresh in minds in terms of where you feel like in this plan. We can key in some of that information, and then when I send the questions, the draft questions, for the survey, then we can add, maybe getting more specific than is anything missing, or maybe if we can acknowledge that there's something missing, we can kind of draft in that and then ask for the community's feedback after that piece is kind of completed. Okay,
great. Any other follow-up questions on that? Oh, well, thank you very much. That was
Yes.
excellent update.
thank you.
Thanks for all your work.
I'll send you the schematic design for that too.
Cool.
Great, okay. So I'll send you, do you want me to send you the link for the interpretive plan?
I mean, I can grab
Okay, right. Okay, Corey. That's it.
Next is Paws in the Park update. Is that accurate?
Sorry. So Bullpine has agreed to do the beer garden. I offered park board help throughout the day a little bit.
What's the date again? Can you remember?
October 19th. October 19th.
Okay,
So I'll send out a schedule calendar to see if we can fill even just like one person to help out. I think just an idea. It's really what they need help with, but. And then we'll have King Youngblood. I don't know if you guys heard of them, they're the upcoming Forest Park kid. And then I have some special guests that may too. So.
very cool.
Should be a fun day, yeah, we'll get lots of food trucks, have like 3 or 4 already. Do an off leash pop-up area off to the side, but it'll be a nice. What day did you say? October 19th.
It's a Saturday.
Yeah, 1 to 5.
It's like our own October fest.
Yeah, with Paws.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not good.
That's terrible.
There's
Is there a cat area?
There was a cat at the pet parade today.
Off leash cat area? It'd be great. Giant sandbox.
Yeah. My cat would not.
Summer events recap.
So, when you're sending the funding update also.
Oh,
Was that? What?
funding
was that there, or
update.
was it the one?
Funding update,
Yeah,
oh, yes.
so good news, bad news. Good news, we have a federal appropriation still in the works, hopefully it can be passed November, December. And then RCO, we got 500 from Alina, the other water access, not so much, so. and then we also are confirmed some more funding from King County Parks Levy that
Great.
we'll be able to get when we start construction, so. We're probably halfway there, if things go well right now, is kind of what I'm seeing, and we have more feelers out. And
So Corey and I haven't talked about this yet, but we can reapply in 2026.
yes,
And so we're right now planning to bid this project in January of 2026.
Yeah.
For ours. Right, yep, if we get to a point where we have totally finished drawings and it is ready to go out to bid. And the thing that is left is needing to raise a little bit more money. Then that's also a decision that the city could make at that time, is to essentially apply for additional funding in the RCO, May 1 deadline again, and go through this, May to July and go through that process. And that may mean that everything is funded except this thing, and we hope that we get the funding for this thing. And then if we get that, then that can move ahead. So it might be in that later part of the project, as some of this funding becomes clearer and we're working through basically the rest of this year and all of next year, hoping that the city's able to write a check to a contractor to start construction in January 2026. If that's not the case, then there will be things that we basically pull out of the project, and say, if we get a bid that means we can afford these things, great. If we get a bid that means we can't, we're not obligated to pay the contractor to build them. And so in that way, it does leave us with some additional flexibility. It's not the favorite thing to do, if you build most of it now and then add on to it later, it's more expensive altogether. You also, inflation works against you in those ways, but it is definitely something that we can do. And so as it's tracking now with the funding that the city has, strong leads on, basically, something will be built.
we'll be
Yeah.
able to start. Then. Fine. Okay. Amy?
Yeah, thanks. Didn't we talk about public funding early on? Where we talked about people buying a brick or doing something, some kind of project like that to raise money to build the park?
Yep, and
Yes.
we'll look at that avenue more as we get into design, and we'll look at trees, benches, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Right. We're expecting that will be in the 70%, where we'll be able to actually say, we can accommodate 1,000 bricks on this project.
Okay.
Where we can say, we'll be able to accommodate, 5 benches, and then basically start to put some kind of ideas and numbers to those. I know one of the things was that the city didn't really have a mechanism to take that sort of donation, and then that was something that was coming together.
Yeah, I think I'll check on it.
Okay.
They have been, or it's in the works, if not, so,
Yeah,
yeah.
I thought I remember it on the agenda.
I think I remember it on the agenda as well.
okay. Yeah. So yes, so absolutely. And then the
Thank
70%, it will sort of be, what are all the things that we can possibly ask the public to sponsor? Depending on how things go with, how much do we need to raise?
yeah,
There's a kind of a sweet spot for, if you only have, 1,000 bricks on a project and they're $10, then you sort of immediately sell out. Do you do the sort of thing where, installing the brick costs $10, and so you ask people to sponsor 100? Is it that sort of thing? How does that come together? So there's gonna be some, questions that the city and this group will probably weigh in on in terms of sponsorship levels and that sort of thing, the circumstance of being left out of something like that is kind of a bummer, everybody's family has brick except yours, sort of thing. And so there's some equity questions, but we'll come with a range of things, and try to be as inclusive as possible in terms of what we can offer. So, yeah.
great.
And is that the decision on that? Would that feed into that like January 1st, 2026? Like,
Oh, so we would do that ahead of time.
The RTO.
Yeah, so we would do that ahead of time. So basically, January 2025, we will be in 70% design. And so that is when we would want to basically start saying, these are the opportunities that we want to include. And then because that's one of the things where if you are, take the Pike Place Market, for example. The contractor did not provide, 500,000 individually inscribed dog tags. It, for the mounting on the fences and barriers. It provided the fence. And it may have provided a box of dog tags. Otherwise, that is a program that the city is basically, or the City of Seattle and the Pike Place Market Foundation that they administer. And so we'll have to figure out, is this an ongoing campaign where we're sort of setting up the city to have a program like that? Or is this something where the city will have to purchase, 2,000 inscribed piggy prints that the contractor will then receive that box of and will set individually into the concrete as the work is done. And so there is a sequence and orchestration part of this. But if it's something like the contractor installs the benches and then the parks crew installs the inscribed plaques, that's usually pretty easy and manageable. And then the tree planting is, same thing. The person buys a tree and, the contractor installs a tree and then the plaque goes on the tree.
It was more a question of, is this filling a gap that we find in the budget,
Oh.
or we raise the money and then that would add to, and then
Well-
hopefully RCO bills.
So almost all of this money requires a match. And so it has to be matched in some way. And so whatever the community, every dollar that the community spends allows the city to receive $1 of grant money, which is kind of an important part of the equation, right? I mean, if you have $1 million to build the project, but you don't have $1 million to match the $1 million of grant funding, then you can't go anywhere. And so I think we wouldn't necessarily set a target. We would set this is as much as we can accept in terms of purchasing, for the project. And the city may not sell all of those things, but the city may be able to sell tree sponsorships in the years following after the park opening. And then those are additional plaques that are kind of put on. And so they're kind of making back whatever the city had to spend to get the match, to get the funding in the first place. But again, some of that, there is an internal operations component of how the park or how the city will manage all of those things.
Yeah.
So it's a bigger conversation, but it's definitely something that, people love seeing their brick, yeah, it's a fun thing.
Yeah, I know what the timing is.
Yeah. Yep, okay. I'm gonna create a little bit of a separate track in our timeline about that, because that will require some coordination.
Some pre-work and.
Mhm. Yeah. So kind of a fundraising, I'll probably start like a sub schedule on fundraising. We'll put in the 2026 RCO dates, start tracking those now. We'll do some fundraising coordination.
They said we would be probably the first one up if city declines money if the project can't happen, so it would be the first in line to receive funding, which happened with 5 Acre Woods, so. Might still be. This year there was 12 applications and previous year there was 4.
Oh,
It's okay.
if we reapply, is there? It's still new.
Yeah,
New
we just
application
update our
process.
scope and funding requests.
Does it help to be farther along in the process or to have a more developed plan or?
In the sense, so basically from starting the project, which the city has already done, and moving it forward, every dollar that they spend on, say, like the consultants or Corey's staff time, that counts as a match. And so in the sense that, right now the city needs, I don't know, $1 million, but last year they needed $1.2 million. But they spent $200,000 on consulting fees, and so now they don't need that much because it's already spent. And so the math will change, the amount of matching that you can demonstrate changes, because as the city is gaining other funding partners and spending money to advance the project, that matching is already satisfied. Yeah, and so I know that that's definitely one of those things, is being able to say, we need 5, but we have 6 already, is a really big deal in terms of saying, we're not gonna have any problem doing fundraising for this project because that work is essentially done. And so making traction on that item, it is definitely a good thing.
Any other thoughts on that, or we're getting a little late on our timeline? We could move on to the summer events recap.
I just wanted to know how the yard sale went. Picnic in the park went well, Tyler was out there with scouts, yeah, Richie came stuff by.
Yeah, we enjoyed it.
Yeah, we did
We
this.
saw several neighbors.
Yeah, I think changing the timeline a little bit, it's a good idea. I think might be like pushing it a little bit up next time. Get there. Yeah. Yeah, the yard sale sounded like it was. It sounded great, probably had 85 people signed up. And then people dropped when the weather got bad, so we ended up having about 70 households participate. It was easy, the Google Maps interface, I think, worked perfectly. There was someone who went rogue on Facebook and made their own map because she didn't like Google Maps.
For everyone.
Yeah, I know.
Knock yourself out.
So, I mean, it was, yeah, but that's great, you know, people were invested and people, I got a ton of great feedback that people met their neighbors, saw new parts of the city that they hadn't been in before. So, that was
Nice.
So, a lot of people said, when's it gonna be? I wanna do it next year.
Twice a year? Oh. Just,
I think once a year.
yeah,
I think once a year, and I'll say why, I feel like if it's always in the fall, then people can like have it in their head where they're like, this thing is coming, but I mean, look, I don't know, we can talk about it.
One of my neighbors can get her, homecoming dance dress at the,
No
Oh, wow.
way. That's
Cool.
so
Look at
cool.
that.
Her what?
it was like the homecoming dance. or
Her
something.
dress.
oh,
Reduce, recycle.
Yeah.
It's
I have,
vintage at that point.
Yeah,
I have a list of like lessons learned, so things that I would do a little differently, but this would be a project that would be super easy to hand off to anyone, like if you have to do it. One thing I was thinking though, was that at the end, like, I liked that it was free to sign up, because then people got involved. But at the end, there was like quite a bit of people joining and then dropping out and then joining and then dropping out. And so there was just sort of like a fair amount of communication and churn. And I was like, I'm a volunteer and yet this is worth something, like I'm doing a service here, right? And I do wonder if there would be a way for us to prepare for next year to make it a $25 donation to participate. And then maybe there would be less churn.
Yeah.
But also we could, you know, have it be a fundraiser and raise awareness for the project. So of course I want everyone to participate who wants to participate. Like I don't want it to be a gateway thing, but I'm trying to think, I don't know. It occurred to me that I was like, you know, like we could do this even better next year. And yeah, that's the only thing else.
Yeah, we can start trying. I have to say that the lady who went rogue did a good job,
Good.
you know, drumming up interest on next door. This, next door is quite the place for finding out where the garage sale is, and so she was able to get the message out that compared to just the Lake Forest part posting, hers is more frequent, so it kind of drilled in, oh, there's going to be a yard sale all over Lake Forest Park.
Cool. I appreciate that. I'm not on Nextdoor, so I was on Facebook stuff. But yeah. It seemed like the word got out.
I'm on
Maybe.
Nextdoor and not on Facebook, so I.
Well, if she was so good at this, maybe she wants to do it next year. I'm just saying,
got a city volunteer.
should track this person down.
I know. Yeah, I think it was good to keep it like that, third week in September. Did you promote it at Picnic in the Park?
Yeah, I had the flyer out there.
Cool, so I think that works well too, to
Yeah.
kind of like, here's the map and then it's sort of building and station.
We have also a new front desk girl that's gonna be taking more over the social media stuff for me, so.
Congratulations.
So things will be improving out here. But, yeah. Any other than? No one in the public.
Any public there? Nope.
Pickleball competition.
Are you
Now we have
challenging?
lines.
I could play pickleball.
You
I
could
would
pick.
love to learn.
You could pick. All right, well,
Is there a volunteer for the news and what's the deadline for that? It's,
Would love a volunteer for the Enos. If you could get me something by the 15th. October. What promise? What part do you want to write?
how many sentences do we get?
No, you can get like a hefty paragraph.
Ooh, hefty. It's like 8 sentences.
It might be.
No,
I'm
sorry.
happy to do something unless someone else is.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can do like, after each meeting, so we can sign up.
Not 5 days a week.
So go find your favorite part. See it.
Alright. See what
Now,
everybody-
5 paper was,
Yeah, and it could be like just a thing at the park, it doesn't have to be the entire park, so.
I can be on the hook for the next one then.
It'd be no.
that could be
November.
early season, it can be,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sounds good. Okay, then public comments. Oh, so with that, no, there aren't any. So with that, I'm going to adjourn us.
Yes.
Good night, everybody.
I
Bye.